to some new people today. I want to thank Carl and his team from Environmental Peace Building for hosting us and doing such important work in this area. So we thought, rather than going through all introductions today, because it takes quite a while to get through with all of us, that we would just introduce some new people who have come in today. So I am seeing some new people on the screen that I will call on, but please let me know if I've missed you. And then I thought, when you do speak up to respond to a question, or to ask a question, just briefly say who you are and where you're from. And that way it will familiarize people, particularly the new people, of who's here. So just, I see Godi, I'm so glad you were able to come today. Hello, do you want to just say your name and where you're from?
Yes, yeah, my name is Godi Godar Moteke Molanga. I grew up from Democratic Republic of Congo. So I moved to United States over 30 years ago. So I'm a founder of Go Conscious Earth.
Great, thank you so much. Let's see, Richie, I believe, is this the first time you've been with us?
No, actually, it's Richmond by.
Oh, okay. So sorry. I'm only seeing names on the screen, so that's why I'm looking at what I'm seeing that might be something new. Is there anybody else who wasn't with us before that is here today?
So it's Adil Zafar. I've invited him to give an Ignite key talk. I mean, Adil, if you want to introduce yourself quickly, I mean, I sent your bio to everybody, but please, you know, Adil has worked with UN for a decade and now in Pacific Water Center. Adil, please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Azim. Good morning, everyone. It's very nice to be part of the conversation. I'm Adil. I'm actually working my way towards a single name gig like Madonna. So just to keep it simple for everyone. I'm the executive director for the Pacific Water Research Center, and my day job is as the professor of professional practice at the School of Sustainable Energy Engineering. Both are at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver. And as Asim said, I have had a couple of decades of experience of working for the UN before arriving here at Simon Fraser University. And I have had the pleasure of working with Asim and a few others to dig really quite deep on the Indus Basin. So I'll be talking a bit about that experience and findings from that work.
Great. Thank you so much for coming today. Okay, I think we're going to then move to Caitlin is going to give us a brief recap from our last meeting before we move on with Adil's presentation and our questions. So, Caitlin.
Morning. So last week, Mickey Glantz from University of Colorado Boulder started by talking about opportunities and challenges for science diplomacy, and that the mountains have problems, fragile highland ecosystems, landslides, floods, and then social problems, poverty, increasing demands for natural resources, including water, and food insecurity. And in highlighting opportunities for science diplomacy, he was stressing the interdependence of the highlands, the midlands, the lowlands, and coastal communities. So those look like upstream and downstream interdependencies, integrated water development, and the really unique ecosystems that are in every mountain watercourse. And also the Highlands to Oceans initiative. So he was also talking about kind of equity considerations, that people in the mountains and the highlands merit assistance to reach their basin development needs. And he concluded talking about mountain reciprocity and restitution for goods and services. And that's where Asim picked up in the Highlands to Oceans initiative. And in introducing it, the background, the motivation really is that over and over again, key stakeholders in these river basins around the world are concerned both about societal well-being and ecosystem well-being. And they are saying that what we need is an international science project with a decentralized network of partners that can work at various scales, the farm, the watershed, the river basin, the continent, the globe, and in the major domains. So that's the biological domain and physical domain where we have climate and water courses. It's the social and economic systems that involve farmers and households and migrants. And it's the policy and governance regimes that are both national and transboundary for our water systems. And within the Highlands to Oceans initiative, they're developing models to integrate all these factors. And a major finding has been that the integrated models require science cooperation and sharing among all the partners in the river basins so that they can address the gaps in the water monitoring and early action systems, and so they can use community-based activism to generate and implement the solutions to problems. So after those two presentations, we had we discussed the three questions rather briefly, but nope, just looking for my notes on that. Here. So the first question is, what are the gaps in the transboundary monitoring, watershed monitoring and water security, early warning, early action systems around flood, drought, famine, water quality and early warnings? One of the things we said was that because we don't have these networks, there isn't an opportunity to exchange data in a timely way. And since we don't have as many joint projects that are jointly funded and jointly managed, that's problematic. There's also been the ongoing issue where some countries have national objectives, or those could be governance at other regime scales as well, take priority for their own national objectives over whatever legal commitment they have, which might be treaties. There's a lack of sufficient funding for high quality resolution equipment and research. And then we need the results to be shared on all sides of the transboundary area, whether those are glacial floods or other types of floods or sea level rise. And that data sharing is often not done between countries in a transboundary watershed because of their own political or security considerations. The second question was about scientist to scientist cooperation, how we'll promote that within and across transboundary river basins. One idea was that international cooperation and sharing between with both locally and regionally for researchers needs to be done for data collected by remote sensing equipment. And that helps build trust and acceptance for everyone sharing benefits from the watershed area. Another issue around this was that we can do more joint studies. This is the idea behind open science, that the data needs to be publicly available and that we can design research projects in transboundary areas where there is publicly available data or using the basis of creating that data. The third question that we discussed was about indigenous knowledge and wisdom and integrating it with scientific knowledge to secure clean water. One idea was just that the community involvement and community ownership are important. Someone posted in the white paper a link to an article that had a framework for doing that. And there were two examples. One was in Papua New Guinea and the other one was in, I've forgotten, but it's there. And then the other thing we talked about was reciprocity, about both scientists and indigenous communities being able to share what they know in order to design programs that arrive at solutions and that are implemented together. And the only thing I was going to add to that some of this language we're using around citizen science or indigenous knowledge, that these are about how we visualize. They're not meant to peg people as citizens or non-citizens or anything like that. So again, they're really useful tool for our visualization about how we can work together. And with that, I'm done.
Thank you. Thanks, Caitlin. So Asim, I think I'll hand it over to you. Will Dr. Nadil begin with presentation now?
Absolutely. So I will just very quickly set the stage. Like, so we have these 3 questions. I sent the email to all of you with these 3 questions. You have the link to the white paper. Maybe Ben, you can put it again, the link there. So please, the way we decided today was to have an Ignite keynote talk from Dr. Adil about that would set the stage from the polycentric governance perspective. As I mentioned on the first part of the symposium, we're talking about really like meta-constitutional situations at the global scale, all the way to, where there is no constitution or governance system that basically governs the interactions between states, all the way to the regional scale watershed treaties that emerge voluntarily or under some crisis situations. But those have also a lot of history and a lot of ecological and social implications as consequently. So I think the first 2 questions are really like how effective and equitable are these existing treaties, like Indus Basin Treaty System, but as well as like Mekong River Commission. And I'm really glad to see Dr. Ibrahim Mohammed from NASA, who's been working on a nature conservancy project in Mekong. So maybe after Adil's conversation, maybe he can say a few words about it as well. But I certainly think that the Indus and the Mekong, we have had some existing treaties, and the Israel, Jordan, Clive already talked about it. It's really, there is no one treaty for Jordan River. It's like a disparate treaties between Israel and Jordan, Israel and Palestine, Israel and Syria. And similarly in Amazon, we have one treaty, but it's very weak. It does not, have, and I'm curious to hear from our participants from Israel Basin, Isabella and Sandra, to talk more about it. But I certainly think that Dr. Adil's presentation on Indus Basin, I see that would have ramifications for all of the other systems as well. So really appreciate, Adil, for you waking up at 5 a.m. Your time to be here. Thank you so much, and for the conversation. And I saw you were adding comments in the white paper as well. So thank you so much. And please, the floor is yours. So with the presentation, I think you should be able to share it. And
Thank you very much, Asim. And again, it's a great pleasure to be here. Good morning, everyone. So what I would do is, let me start by sharing my screen, actually. I do want to talk a bit more specifically about the Indus Basin and the Indus Water Treaty. And I'll sort of use that as a way of talking about, how some of the findings are applicable to other basins. And I'm much more familiar with the Jordan and Mekong River basins and less so with the Amazon. But I think, as Asim said, some of the findings might be applicable across the board. So, like I said, I'll use Indus Water Treaty as a case study. And just to recap, and I recognize that some of these points might have been discussed in the previous 2 sessions. But a quick summary of the broad challenges in the Indus Basin, and again, there are similarities to others. There are obviously changing climate patterns, rainfall patterns, and monsoon failures have been there. There is also a sense of accelerating glacier melt. But I think by and large, there is still considerable uncertainty in the long-term forecasts. And I think we should recognize that before sort of jumping too far ahead to say what kind of solutions would work, to recognize that there are significant uncertainties. There's also increasing water demand, and again, that's pretty much true across the board. And population growth, by and large, is the significant driver there. But there are obviously other reasons to do with hydrology as well. And just to give you an example, that when in 1950s, when the Indus Water Treaty was being negotiated, the water availability was over 5,000 cubic meters per capita per year. And now in Pakistan, it's hovering around 1,000 cubic meters per capita per year. It's dropped a little bit lower than that. So it's sort of dropped below the threshold of water scarcity. And obviously that water scarcity has consequences for food insecurity and impacts on agricultural production. There are increasing environmental impacts, partly because of water quality being deteriorated, And this was one of my points to the white paper, that it's actually the urban inputs in terms of the sheer volume, which are much larger compared to any industrial inputs into these water systems. And that has impacts on aquatic ecosystem, and there's also reduced flow to the delta region, and that has problems of its own. One sort of hidden aspect of water management is groundwater management, and there's really, at least in the Indus Basin, there's no real mechanism of controlling. There's no governance structures in place. There's no licensing to speak of. And there are, I think, some ongoing challenges, and they've been exacerbating over time, that have to do more with governance and management. Overall, there is a more sort of conflict-based approach rather than cooperative management, which again was the original notion way back in the 1950s when the Indus Water Treaty was designed. The other major difference is that now, as I mentioned a moment ago, that there is a scarcity that has to be managed as opposed to an excess of water that had to be managed when the treaty was signed. There are a number of disputes that have triggered sort of international negotiation process, or even going to the International Court of Justice or the International Court of Arbitration. The Baglihar Dam construction and the Kishanganga hydroelectric project, both of those are, at least in the legal sense, they have been resolved, but they still remain politically sensitive issues. And there are a lot more dams being planned by India on their side, which is understandable in terms of their demands and needs. But that is, again, probably going to trigger more legal conflicts down the road. The Indus Water Treaty doesn't really talk at all about water quality. So when we say that there is degradation of the aquatic ecosystems, there's no real mechanisms to address that in the current legal regime. And of course, to state the obvious, Afghanistan and China as two upstream riparians are not included. And maybe in the 1950s and 60s, that wasn't an issue, but now we see there are efforts on part of China to build dams on the upstream side. And in Afghanistan, although there's lots of political upheaval, and it's probably going to continue now with the Americans pulling out, but at some point, it's foreseeable that there would be development projects upstream. And so we have to take into consideration how those would be dealt with on a basin scale. So before I get into what kind of solutions might work and probably draw parallels to other basins, I think it's good to take a moment to think about the political realities in the basin. So, you know, the major challenge is the number of handicaps. Many of them are political, which are quite deeply ingrained, and they're resistant to change. There's also complexity of how these different elements interlink with each other. And if we have time, we can unpack those a little bit more. But the interesting bit is, and this is kind of what we discovered in the work that we undertook to sort of put into this book on imagining Industan, which was kind of a alternative world, blue sky thinking about how the basin could be managed, that there is actually quite a catalog of cooperative opportunities and instruments that can be triggered, and most of these are within the realm of possibility, in that they would be politically viable, you know, if there is focus put on those. And there's also the flip of the problem that if the riparian states are not sharing water, there's a huge price to pay, and all kinds of penalties, which are social, economic, political, and strategic, that everyone in the basin will have to pay. So let me talk a little bit about what the cooperation opportunities are, and I think this is probably a place where we can think of how these opportunities might be similar to what you see in Jordan or Mekong River or the Amazon. So the first one is to build cooperation around climate change, and because there's such a gap in the knowledge around what's happening and what the forecasts are, and to build more confidence, there is a great opportunity for information sharing. And one thing which one would have thought would happen is that the countries in the Indus Basin would probably start taking common positions in the climate change negotiations because the impacts are similar, the results and adaptations are similar. That hasn't happened. It's certainly hasn't happened in the Jordan Basin, and I think the Mekong River Commission has gone partly in that direction, but because China is not part of MRC, so that again diverts from this notion of using climate change as an issue around which common positions are built. In terms of disaster and responses to disasters, particularly around flooding, it's quite obvious that none of the countries are capable on their own to respond to these disasters, particularly when you get 1 in 100-year flood or 1 in 50-year flood. And there is a great opportunity to build resilience at the community level, and that can eventually lead to regional disaster risk reduction. And this is a topic that I'm sure Asim is very well familiar with and probably would have brought up in previous conversations. And in order to get to that, you need to think about some real-time data sharing. And I think with a number of the innovations which are available, and if I can jump forward to the last bullet point here, in terms of remote sensing tools like drones and microsatellites, I think there's lots of interesting opportunities. One aspect, and again, it's going a little bit farther away from purely water sharing, but again, experience in other basins tells us that broadening up the discussion to include energy in the equation actually makes it easier to come up with solutions which are sort of amenable and acceptable to everyone. And it's surprising that a region, the size of Indus Basin is not actually connected through energy grids. And you look at any other similar region elsewhere in the world, and you see that there are, shared power grids. So the international community can certainly play a role in facilitating that process. There are already a number of energy corridors in planning, and most of these run north-south, going from Central Asia down to the Arabian Sea. So what we need is more horizontal energy corridors going east to west as well. Trade is an interesting way of sort of shifting away from purely water-based negotiations, and joint trade and industrial development, I think, should be a model, and we can use the European Union as a way of looking at how a trade community of this size can operate. And the other interesting bit that has come up in our discussions is using Indus for navigation purposes. And finally, as I said, some of the out-of-box technological innovations might be of help. Application of artificial intelligence and machine learning for managing and forecasting, I think, is there. And given that a lot of the IT hubs in the world are based in this part of the world, it seems logical that particularly the Indus Basin should be leading the world in these AI applications around forecasting in particular. And there's also ways of engaging communities, particularly I think there's opportunities for using smartphone-based monitoring tools that can give you real-time access to data. Now, there's been a bit of discussion. I'll just be very brief here and circle back to it if there's interest. as I said, the Indus Water Treaty is not currently serving the needs that have emerged over the last few decades. And there's been discussions of whether the treaty should be scrapped, and certainly Prime Minister Modi has made comments in that direction, that it's useless and should be scrapped. And that has triggered counter arguments from the Pakistani politicians who said doing so would be an act of war. But anyway, so there are some benefits in restarting and doing it from scratch, and that would allow to engage, for example, China and Afghanistan more directly. The risks are also significant that there might be a total collapse, and it will take a long period. We know that negotiating a treaty can be at least of the order of a decade to get it in place. So that is one option. The other one is to basically start adding new annexes to the treaty. In a way, it's a bit of a path of least resistance, and you can bring in some of the more contemporary thinking through the UN Watercourses Convention. And the other way, which is I think a little bit less efficient, is to develop separate MOUs and agreements to address specific issues. And that may be an approach that's attractive particularly to China, because in previous history, and as we've seen in the Mekong River Basin as well, that China doesn't really get engaged in multilateral arrangements, although that might in itself be changing. And there are voices and experts and researchers within China who are arguing that China should in fact be participating in those multilateral systems. So just a couple of parting thoughts in terms of why the world should care in terms of addressing these issues. So there is a role of region in the global geopolitics in terms of 3 nuclear armed states and ongoing conflicts in Kashmir and elsewhere. And as I said earlier, Afghanistan now seems to be at the brink of maybe another civil war. So those are geopolitically significant issues, and there is significant history of armed conflict, both in historical timeframes, but more recently we've seen tensions both between India, Pakistan, and China-India borders. There are also successionist trends that can unravel the regional security. And, there is a risk of political instability. So there was an interesting US intelligence community assessment back in 2012, almost a decade ago, that had identified actually Mekong, Jordan, and Indus Basin were the 3 basins out of a group of 8 or 9 basins where they had identified these as having high risk of political instability and internal collapse of some of these countries. And let me just leave off with some thoughts of what can be done and how particularly the international community can come in. So there is certainly lots of room for international assistance on human, financial, technological, and institutional aspects. There also is a role to play as honest brokers in bringing these disparate parties to the table. And again, I think with China's growing political influence, there are groupings like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization that can play a significant role in brokering these arrangements. The 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the SDGs are, in a way, an excellent framing, at least in a conceptual way. But given that we are not doing so great in achieving those targets or being on a pathway to achieving those targets, you can take that with a pinch of salt. And of course, some of the climate change funding could be directed to the region to address these issues. And again, all kinds of international organizations from the UN system to the World Bank to regional cooperation organizations can play a significant role. So I'll stop here. Hopefully I didn't go on for too long, and I'll pass the floor back to you, Asim.
Adil, thank you so much. This is really, like very thought-provoking presentation. You've really brought out all dimensions of these treaty-related issues and the history, but also moving forward, what are the options and all the complexity that we see in terms of geopolitical, like track one diplomacy, but also where track two and track three diplomacy can be harnessed to set the stage for next steps in track one diplomacy. So that was really, so I mean, with that, like I would really open up the floor for you to like have any questions for Adil, or if you have any additional responses to add to the first two questions, which I posted, like how effective and how equitable are the existing treaties? And Adil has already said a lot about those, but as well as how well can we like reform them or create new treaties to account for water quality, as well as climate change related issues. But so there are like a climate change uncertainty and water quality. So I mean, while you're thinking about your questions, I'll just pose this question to Adil. It's like, Adil, the water quality was not really a big concern or climate change in 1960s when the Indus Basin Treaty was negotiated. And it seems to me that shouldn't be like a low-hanging fruit for all the riparian countries to come up with some kind of regional-based position in the UNFCCC negotiations, but as well as like have some kind of a common, at least start with some kind of like confidence-building measures in this space about coming up with some standards for water quality that could be kind of like communicated across all the riparian partners, upstream and downstream.
So I think you're absolutely right in terms of climate change. It is a low-hanging fruit, and one would have thought that there would be a fairly strong regional positioning in the climate change negotiations, and that hasn't happened at all. And I think there's two main reasons, both of which should be addressed and are in the realm of possibilities. The first reason is the political or the geopolitical, how should I say, conflict between India and Pakistan, and that has the tone and the temperature hasn't come down in the last, I would say, 5 to 10 years. I think so. That's a little bit unfortunate. But again, I think there are these track two opportunities for going around that, certainly at the expert level. But the second issue, I think, which is probably more fundamental, is that there is significant lack of knowledge about what the regional impacts are. So I have not, maybe I'm ignorant, but I've not seen very significant and prominent studies which have looked at the downscaling of climate change to regional and local level impacts. So there is a real knowledge vacuum, and I think that's partly the reason why you can't easily build common positions, because you don't really have an agreed framework of how what the impacts will be. So that should be a great opportunity to start the expert community to come together and to form some kind of a scientific coalition to address those knowledge gaps. In terms of water quality, I think that's a deeper and perhaps in some ways more local issue. And we have done some studies around Indus, because initially we thought that the industrial effluents would be a major problem. But when you look at the pollutant loading and the organic loading into the river systems, it's actually the urban areas which are the real culprit, which means that the solutions have also to be derived at the urban level. So that's less of a transboundary issue. There certainly is room for providing resourcing for research and for monitoring at the regional scale. So that maybe is the framing to create an enabling environment. But the real action would really need to happen at the urban scale, and that is a little bit difficult to do that through a transboundary treaty.
Okay, great. This is right on. So I see a question from Senator Maiman, and there is some discussion going on in the chat. So maybe Senator Maiman can start, and then maybe after him, we can have Michael, Isabel, and Larry. I mean, all of them have contributed some interesting questions if you want to state those. So Senator Maiman, floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I must say that it was a pleasure to hear you, of course, always, and now Dr. Adil. I think he has really, his presentation was a very short one though, but in a very short time, he has covered most of the challenges that are there. And of course, he has also proposed solutions and the focus that is required. So I would say that there's hardly anything to be added, but I would tend to agree that in terms of the quality and in terms of the groundwater, there is absolutely nothing in the Indus Water Treaty because one has been going through it and that's not there. And I would tend to agree that climate change was obviously not an issue. And now that it is there, and environment was also not an issue which was touched in the Indus Water Treaty. Therefore, this is, as you said, it's a low-hanging fruit. Yes, I think. And this is something, it's an ongoing thing. The whole world is focusing on 2030. We are moving towards carbon reduction and so on and so forth, temperature reduction and greenhouse emission. So therefore, I think this is where I would say, despite all the political temperature that keep rising from time to time, we can address. I would just like all of us to understand that despite the fact that there has been temperature rises, there has been awards of the International Court of Justice and arbitration, and yet the issues remain because fundamentally there is not established open communication between the countries. It is, I want this and you want this and let's talk about it. So this is how it's going. So I would say that in order to really open up, the science must come in. And I think Dr. Adil mentioned about the AI and various other aspects. So I think that should be our focus. And I would say that let's take the environment consideration was not there and let us start from the environment. And that is how we will come in. Now, there was a discussion whether there is efforts going on no, in the past on these. I think there's one thing, ISI mode is, I don't see them in the list here, Dr. Ghulam Rasool, who is representing. But let me fill in for him because I've been associated with them since the time they have started. The Indus Forum was established somewhere around as a subsequent to the Abu Dhabi dialogue, which started in 2005 or 6, and then 2012, the Upper Indus Basin, Pakistan was established. Now, this is very interesting. Upper Indus Basin was established in Pakistan by ISI mode, and various work groups were there, and various people started to work it. It worked out so well that in 2018, the UIB network, Upper Indus Basin Network, was converted from Pakistan to all the 4 countries. And they are regularly meeting, and each of them have a chapter in their country: India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and China. Some to a lesser degree, some to a higher degree. Now, ISIMOD being the organization which is serving all these countries in the South Asia, therefore, this project is there and it is going on, and a lot of work has gone in. And therefore, I think we must coordinate, cooperate with them rather than starting something new. So that's there. And I would say that this is one. The Knowledge Forum is also there. However, we have, this group has the similarity that we are talking of the science. Now, you as the science-based international forum, and therefore, I think there's a higher level of starting with the first going with the general knowledge and then the science and now the political one. So I think these 3 tracks that you have gone in, to me, it appears to be a higher level of a chance to get into the system and using all the rest of the thing. And of course, one can talk about it, the details, but I'll just stop here to say that these should be there. And SCO is yes. And also please understand that there is also the Kabul River joins in. And Kabul River is starting Pakistan. Chitral sends its water to the Kabul River, which means upstream, and then it comes as a downstream into Pakistan. And the Kabul River is also joined by Central Asian country. Therefore, you mentioned about the SCO, and I would encourage that. Let's think about that too, because this network of Kabul and Indus could also join in. And since politically now all the countries are working together to find a political solution after the withdrawal of the US forces from Afghanistan, I think this might be the right time to say there is a benefit. So I would come back to my earlier thing. Let's talk about the benefit sharing rather than the water sharing. And when we talk about the benefit, then we talk about the environment and all the rest of the thing. So beautifully explained by Dr. Adil. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator, for like expounding all ongoing Track 1 efforts in Indus Basin Forum, as well as the SCO in the Kabul River. So, Adil, do you have any response to Senator Maimon's comments, or should we move on to the next set of?
Well, I certainly am in agreement with all the points you made, but I like the final point about benefit sharing. I think is certainly the way to think about it. And quote unquote benefits, I think, have to certainly go beyond water, because if you're boxing yourself in, and that's why I was talking about energy, about trade, about navigation, I think all of those aspects have to really come into sharper focus. There were a couple of comments by Larry, and hi Larry, good to see you. I just want to quickly touch on that, because he was talking about what is a good treaty versus a bad treaty, and whether it's better to have something than nothing at all. And I just have two quick comments. I think in terms of whether a treaty is good or bad, I think that's a little bit of a hard call to figure out, whether it falls in one direction or the other. The way I would view it is that the gold standard we have is the 1997 Watercourses Convention. So you compare it and see what's in the treaty and what's missing, and that should give you some sense of where to go. And I wouldn't really consider any treaty as bad, but rather see that how much room there is for further improvement. So just a little bit more nuance on that. That treaties aren't really good or bad, but rather how much room for expansion there is, or incorporating other issues that might have emerged since the treaties were originally put in place.
Thank you. I see a comment from Isabel, and then we can move to Ali. I see Ali is joined in. Isabel, you want to bring out your comment? You want to expound?
Hi, Hassan.
Yeah,
can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, perfect. So my question was how we can reshape a treaty when there is no synergy between the riparian countries. And I was mentioning about in the Amazon case, because as I think that is well aware the situation in Brazil, that we are having an environmental crisis, and we just lost our environmental minister yesterday. So all the situation that we are having here is affecting the riparian relations. So how can we reshape that treaty? How can we reshape the cooperation that we have in the Amazon with this lack of synergy? And I think that this is not only something that applies to the Amazon, it can be considering the other cases that we are taking into consideration.
I think Adil hinted to that, that it is a decades-long process. It's and that's why we're thinking about Track 3, Track 2 initiatives to set the momentum for Track 1 negotiations. But of course, at some point, the Track 1 folks have to come in and start negotiations. So it could be like a back road diplomacy or back channel diplomacy, but in the end, somebody has to come up front. But Adil, you want to add any more to Isabel's question? How do we really start the conversation on Track 1? So.
Yeah, let me make just one quick comment on Brazil and the Amazon. Generally speaking, I think Brazil has done remarkably well in terms of managing a very complex and diverse system across its states, and it's not perfect, but at least institutionally, I think they've gone a long way in managing its own waters, and it has, I think, at boundary level, it has worked out quite well, quote unquote, big brother, in terms of not having a confrontational or an antagonistic relationship with the other riparians, particularly the downstream ones. So I think it's the situation, in my view, is a little bit better compared to others. In terms of how to start, I think the sort of the economic side of things, and if you can make attractive economic arguments, I think that's a very good starting point. And I would say, give the example of the Red Sea to Dead Sea transfer system that has actually brought together, Jordan, Israel, and the Palestinians. And although they haven't managed to secure the $10+ billion needed to build the system, that certainly demonstrates that when there is common economic interest and common, maybe to some extent, environmental interest, you can in fact bring disparate and even warring factions together and to have them point in the right direction. And to the benefit of that particular initiative, they have raised over $1 billion for working on that initiative. So I think economics may be a significant part of this.
Thank you, Adil. So I see like next Ali, then Gauri, and then Larry. Ali, please take. You need to unmute, Ali. Thank you.
Okay. You
Yeah.
can
Now
you hear me now?
Yes.
Thank you, and apologies for joining a bit late. I was traveling, but I attended part of the presentation by Adil, and I think some of these points are important, and I also heard Senator Nisar. Any treaty is likely to have certain omissions. We get wiser with time. If it doesn't cover Indus Water Treaty, in our case, groundwater or climate or other issues, there are very rich clauses that do not forbid signing additional protocols and joint initiatives and all that. What is extremely challenging for us all, that of more than 100 transboundary rivers, most transboundary rivers do not have shared or joint institutions. I think important challenge for us looking at the century ahead is to see how we can nurture and develop and design and protect some joint institutions. In some regions, the situation may be very hot, and it may not be, they may not be very receptive to start with this kind of thinking, but with the ultimate goal of climate proofing some of our treaties, such as Indus Water Treaty, we'll have to think what can be the joint institutions, what can be the design and the authority or the mandate of some of these institutions. And I'll submit 4 very quickly. One is that they need to have the authority for management, ultimately, enforcement of the agreed principles or provisions, and very importantly, they need to have a joint data sharing or data collection mechanisms in place. And most importantly in this regard is probably shared climate change scenarios, projections on which they wish to collect data and agree on the methodologies so that their findings are not contested by one side or the other. Now, in order to lay the foundation for shared institution for climate proofing of such treaties in so many transboundary rivers that we have, we need to be very modest in our initial ambition of first 5-7 years to create some space within the policy making circles that can give a little bit of legitimacy, resources, or physical spaces, or adhering to some of those findings that may come out of such shared institutions. So in this regard, my final comment, I think, is that it is absolutely critical for us to see in the South Asian context the notions of equitable benefit sharing. I know Adil spoke about it. I've been writing about it for years now, and this is absolutely critical that we create a common space through equitable benefit sharing instead of living with the history that divided the rivers. Thank you.
Ali, thank you very much. Very thought-provoking ideas, and I think very practical to some extent, to building off of where we stand. So we've definitely taken note of these and probably would add it to the white paper as well. So I think, Godi, you were next. I'm mindful of the time, so let's move on to. Godi, you are still unmuted. Would you please sorry, muted. You need to unmute yourself.
Okay.
Yeah,
Can
now
you
you're good. Yes.
I really appreciate these conversations and the opportunity. And as I can speak a little bit based on my experience growing up in the Congo Basin, and how can I really bring this opportunity to bring Congo Basin into conversations, specifically the Congo Basin is, to me, is like the second lung of our planet, the most resilient to our climate exchange. And central Congo Basin, the peat landscape there is a complex to carbon sequestrations, which is it's really vital to all of us. So in 2016, discovered the world largest below the ground and a carbon stock in the DRC. So storage 33 billion tons of carbon equivalent to 20 years of US fossil fuel emissions. So I would like to really to see these conversations come to bring the awareness of the importance of peatland in the DRC, as well to how I can integrate the indigenous people who are really suffering and from years and the colonials and until today. And my passion behind my missions in this to really empower the local people and to benefit from their forestry and ancestors, land rights, and so to bring them to the conversations so their words can be heard from international community to bring the opportunity. So I really appreciate for everyone here, and the youth I have to must engage, because it is really a tipping point, and for everyone to join hands and to do whatever we can to help our planet and to pass on the next generation. And this is really, really beautiful. Thank you so much, and for sharing this information to all of us and bringing
Godi, thank you very much. I see that
who grew up in the jungle and to.
Great. Thank you. I mean, I think the point is that when we talk about benefit sharing, that the carbon sequestration benefits, but also biodiversity in Congo Basin, those also create like global scale, regional scale benefits that we need to think about when we are about talking about ecological cooperation or track one cooperation. So I think, thank you so much, Godi. This is very, very important point. So Larry, I'm mindful of the time. We have about 4 minutes left in this section. And Larry, and then I see Carl. We'll switch at 9:30 to the next one. So Larry, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. I want to follow directly on what Godi said, because I think in a more general framework, what he's talking about is a kind of a nomenclature. How do we frame the challenge? Lungs of the planet is one way of articulating an interest that stands outside of orthodox kinds of realist state thinking and so on. So, I think oftentimes in the transboundary context, we forget that I think there's a utility in trying to think like a state, to where water is power, but so how do you speak to state entities in their own language to help them move them in a particular direction, one way or another? Related to that is also timelines. My own experience across Southern Africa is that there's no hurry. If you are two ministers of energy and water meeting, you're reluctant to take a final decision because you will be gone and another minister will come. And I see a lot of unwillingness to jeopardize, to take a decision that will lock in a state, that ends up in a treaty that, that you have on treaties that you have on the Nile. My last point is around, there's also personal relations involved in this. So what I've seen is that if there's more than one shared basin, the same people end up talking to each other in different contexts. And so in some ways, personal relations are also matter. I've seen how some high-level functionaries talk about each other in the corridors of meetings. So there's a number of other little things around behaving like states, interacting in state spaces, that I think has to, whether we like it or not, we have to sort of articulate that or bring that into the benefit sharing literature, the greener literature, I suppose, or our own greener way of thinking about things. As difficult as that might be, you have to walk a mile in the shoes of, someone you'd rather not even talk to in some cases.
Thank you very much, Larry. I think these are really, very insightful comments. Let's have more conversation about these. But we'll definitely bring these into the white paper conversation. And as we circulate the version for comments and exposition, please feel free to add more to some of these points. I wish we had more time to discuss these. Carl, I think you were next. I see your hand has gone down, but
there are two questions and comments that I just wanted to put out there quickly. First, I noted in Adil's excellent presentation a lot of the broad challenges, and I'm mindful of the experience in the Middle East where people have tried to bring together communities to build peace. We're worse off than we were when they started. It has nothing to do, it's not their responsibility, but there are bigger forces at play. And I'm wondering two questions in that. One, how do you define success? What are you trying to accomplish that might be reasonable? And two, how do you keep doing this year in, year out when things continue to look more grim and not more hopeful? I'll stop there.
Carl, these are very challenging questions, but Adil, you want to take them on? I mean, I think these are definitely elephants in the room. So.
Well, they're $1 billion questions each. I think in terms of defining success, that one is actually, not so challenging if the parties put their mind to it. And I think if you look at the Mekong River Commission, generally, even with the exclusion of China. I think there have been some long-term goal setting and sort of milestones along the way. That hasn't happened in either Jordan or the Indus basins. But I think success is probably defined as identification and initiation of processes rather than endpoints, because the endpoints can, they're stretchable and they can take forever. I mean, I can't generalize how do you keep on going, but I can certainly see that there are always reasons for optimism about both the potential for changes and how things can improve. And again, I would give the example of the Red Sea to Dead Sea transfer, that even within the geopolitical situation of worsening relations between certainly the Israel government and the Palestinian Authority, those kind of initiatives still have survived. So I think there is certainly reason for optimism.
Adil, thank you so much. I mean, so we are at like 9:33. So there is some repetition. Okay. So Susan, I think now is the time to move. So Susan, now is the time to move to getting.
Right, Asim, you're just getting a little bit of a repetition. Right, Asim. Oh, are we all? Is that happening to all of us? No. Okay, it sounds like we're okay now. Asim, are you?
I think I just want to say that we can move on to the final question, but also we wanted to end the part 3 of the symposium with an actual opportunity for which we have, Susan has invited Michael Phillip and she'll introduce, but we really wanted to kind of like set the stage with Michael Phillip's Ignite talk on this final third question about what innovative polycentric governance approaches can address transboundary subnational conflicts. How can public-private partnerships, some that actually came out in our part 1 as well from Adil's comments, and social entrepreneurship address persistent water security challenges. So Susan, you want to like have more elaborate introduction to Michael and then probably take it from there. So thanks.
Okay, thank you. So, this is a kind of unusual, I think, in a forum like this, that we would bring in someone to talk about what I'm going to frame as sustainable finance. I took note of Dr. Adil saying that economics are a key potential opportunity and kind of important piece of the puzzle here in order to make things happen. I think we all know, whether it's, we like it or we don't, that money enables things to happen around the world. And I think with, the work that we started at least 5 years ago in Montreal, that started with, a fairly small group of all community activists, scientists, government people. We met in Montreal, basically over the Kabul River between Afghanistan and Pakistan. Within now 5 or so years, we went from 55 different partners and community groups around the world to about 75 now in 6 different river basins, which have been pretty much represented on these calls in the last 3 weeks. Many community groups who haven't been on this call that have been a part of this work in the last several years. So we've amassed as Asim, identified a network of networks with the idea that our group would not move finances around. We don't ask people for money for membership. We want to support in a decentralized way each river basin, their own community groups, their own local people, to empower them to find the solutions. As Asima said, track 2 and track 3 diplomacy. And, the question that Carl just raised about what is success, I think for, us from the very beginning, it was fairly simple. It was like clean water quality for Because if we don't have water, if we don't have clean water due to climate change and everything else that's happening, we literally will not survive. So to me, you know, how do we get to clean water? And if track 2 and track 3 can make these things happen on the ground, I think, as Michael will kind of share with us, governments then start to pay attention, because, you know, we can't depend anymore. And I think this is an excellent conversation, and people should bring up more about the treaties and the intersection between track 1, track 2, and track 3, because they're all key and important. And we know how that the track 1 can actually obstruct things that are going on in track 2 and track 3. But I think we can't wait for the governments to support these treaties, that if they see that the economics on the ground, and that, as someone I think brought up, this mutual benefit sharing is a reality, governments tend to pay attention. And I think Michael will address that to some extent. So, okay. Lately, you know, many of us, I think, in this community, particularly in the science community, are often funded by foundation support, academic support. You know, we know USAID and World Bank and all the kind of critiques lately of sustainable development. Well, you know, totally, and I agree with Dr. Adil as well, the SDGs are all an excellent framework to think about as a worldwide shared way of seeing the problems. The actual implementation has been problematic. It doesn't seem fast enough. And there's a lot of critical talk now about sustainable development and how that's occurred. So I'm going to now introduce Michael and a whole network of people that Michael has worked with and has been involved with. And he'll explain also Aniket Shah's work, who we're sorry was not able to come today, but will be available to speak with us in the future. And it's because there's a lot of money now that is around the world. And it's showing up, whether we like it or not, in many different ways, right? With particular individuals, or with, you know, different kinds of funds, development funds. And there are, what I'm coming to understand, and I am totally just new to all of this, is that there are people who really do care about the environment. They want to help. They want local communities to do their own grassroots, sustainable ways of moving this forward. But how to get the finances into these communities is really key. And how do we get some of this money from these different places right now actually to the work on the ground? And that we're going to talk about a potential way to do that at the end of the hour. But I wanted to introduce Michael now, Michael Phillip. I'll just say a little bit about Michael and the really amazing work that he is doing right now. Michael is the co-chair of the Bhutan Foundation, and he'll talk to you about the amazing work that's going on in Bhutan right now that I think is another thing that maybe we all would want to think about and share. He's the managing partner of the Mbada Capital Partners, which is a merchant bank that seeks to develop businesses as a positive force for change for people, communities, and the environments in which they operate, and to advance sustainability as a core competency. He has been chairman and chief executive of Credit Suisse for Europe, Middle East, and Africa. So Michael, I'll turn it over to you now to just kind of share with us some of your ways that you identify sustainable finance right now in the world and the kinds of things that are possible.
Great. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes,
All
sir.
right, good. Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Asim. Great to be here with everybody. I'm going to give you a brief introduction just so you have a little bit of my background and some of the projects that I worked on. And then, you know, we can talk about this whole broader subject of sustainable finance and, I know even the word sustainability is, under question these days. And, we oftentimes now use regenerative or other ways to describe the kind of development that we're seeking. But for now, I'll use sustainable finance as sort of a broad umbrella topic. So first of all, I do want to apologize that Aniket couldn't join us today. Aniket is a great friend and colleague of mine. We've worked together on a number of projects in different areas. He has a great background in the UN SDGs. He worked with the Sustainable Solutions Development Network, Jeff Sachs, and others for years in helping to develop the SDGs and consulting with the UN and then implementing them. So he's got a broad experience in that. And then for the last 6 years, he's been either the head of impact investing or sustainable equity research at some major institutions, Oppenheimer and UBS. And now he's the overall head of global sustainability at Jefferies, an investment bank in New York. And he works hard to, implement some of the things that we're doing in, real finance world. He also has a PhD from Oxford, which was all focused on development banks, mostly what's wrong with the development banks and, and some suggestions on how that could be fixed. So I think he'll be an interesting person for all of you to meet and talk to. So let me go back to my background. As Susan mentioned, Credit Suisse, basically for 25 years, from 1982 to 2008, I was in the global investment banking world. It's never something that I sort of set out to do. I sort of wandered my way in through the futures and options part of it, but then ended up at some major institutions. I spent significant time at Goldman Sachs, at Merrill Lynch, at Deutsche Bank, and at Credit Suisse, both in New York and London, working on various issues. I was on the managing board of both Deutsche Bank and Credit Suisse, so I have seen the banking industry from high places and can also tell you what's right and wrong with it. And in 2008, I left. I tried to leave in 2002, but got called back by Credit Suisse for 3 years. But in 2008, I left and started this family investment company, Ambata Capital Partners, the merchant bank that Susan talked about, that really focused on 4 areas initially: clean energy, overall water quality, food security, and energy efficiency as well. With that, we ended up partnering with a group in Iceland called Reykjavik Geothermal to do some major geothermal projects around the world. And right now we're building the 2 largest privately funded geothermal projects in the world in Ethiopia. And we've been doing that for almost 10 years now. So I'll take you through some of the challenges of getting a large scale energy project up and running like that in Ethiopia, where we were the first independent power company to come in. They had never worked with a private company before. And then recently, over the last 2 years, which is how I met Susan, I've been living in Vermont, and we've been working on regional food systems issues. And we started a company called the Regenerative Food Network that focuses on creating regenerative food systems and sustainable food systems locally in the state of Vermont and around the Northeast. And that's when you're working on those issues, it tends to put you in a national and global dialogue as well. And then the last thing I'll touch on is I have a long conservation background. I've worked with World Wildlife, Nature Conservancy, and other conservation and environmental organizations for 25, 30 years. I was on the board of World Wildlife Fund in the US for 6 years, and that is how I made my connection into Bhutan. They've had an office in Bhutan for 30 years. And we started a project there to permanently finance the national parks of Bhutan, which is 52% of the landmass of Bhutan, and is sort of a key pillar as part of gross national happiness, underpinning, their sustainable economic development. So we raised a substantial amount of money there over a 4-year period. And I'll take you through that financing as well, because that's a different sort of type of financing, conservation finance to project finance that you would do for something like the geothermal plants. But in general, I think what I want to touch on is in my experience in working in both conservation, where a lot of the money comes from foundations and philanthropy and government, and development banks, and working in the private sector on these large energy projects, you need to be able to understand all the different types of money that are out there and the motivations of the various donors or investors, and how do you get them to work together to get a project done in the right way, as opposed to just getting a project done, with the, as we call it, this sort of extractive mentality that you're just going to take, as much money, as much resources, as much whatever out, and you don't really care what's left over. Instead, you're trying to do a project that works with the community and helps create long-term sustainable economic development, and is positive for the environment as well. That takes a different type of mentality and a different type of approach. You're not trying to cut corners, and do other things to maximize profit or maximize value for shareholders. You're trying to maximize the overall benefit for society and the environment. And that would be sort of my definition of what sustainable finance is. And we can talk longer term about whether a current system based on capitalism or GDP or anything actually is conducive to real sustainable finance, which I would argue it probably isn't. And having lived in the Bhutanese environment for the last 10 years that operates under gross national happiness, where what they're trying to achieve is under these 4 pillars: sustainable economic development, preservation of the environment, preservation of culture and heritage, and good governance. And if you're trying to maximize those things, as opposed to just gross domestic production, where money is just chasing itself, essentially, that helps. Having an overall framework like that helps. So I think that's a broader discussion that we all can talk about. But let me just go through specifically some of the projects that we've worked on, just to show you how you can bring together different pieces of financing to get things done. So in our geothermal projects, these are 2 500 megawatt projects. So if you take one 500 megawatt power project, first of all, you don't do it in one stage, you do it in multiple stages. So you sort of do 50 megawatts and then another 100 and another 100, getting up to 500. But overall, 500 megawatts is a $2 billion project. All right. How do you finance a $2 billion geothermal project in Ethiopia, where a lot of the institutional money around the world that does power projects doesn't really understand geothermal? Almost all the geothermal projects that have ever gotten done in the world have been done off of government balance sheets. So the government of Iceland has financed geothermal in Iceland, and the government of New Zealand has financed geothermal in New Zealand and Philippines and Mexico, and even in the United States. So there has never really been private financing of those kind of projects, because people didn't really understand the risks involved. They thought geothermal was really riskier than it actually is. And then you've got the issue of Ethiopia, right? Ethiopia was also not a place where people had invested heavily. Most of the power projects in Ethiopia are big hydro projects that have been financed, primarily by the World Bank and African Development Bank, the big development banks, the governments, not always for the benefit of either the people or certainly the environment. I'm sure, given this is a water group, you all have your opinions on large hydro projects. So one of the reasons we wanted to do the geothermal projects is to lessen the pressure on Ethiopia to continue to develop their hydropower. So to start a $2 billion project like that, basically what you need is $500 million of equity from somebody who understands the risks and is willing to take on those risks. And that 500 million of equity attracts in $1.5 billion of loans. About $1 billion will come from development banks, and you need some one of the big global development banks to take the lead. In this case, it was African Development Bank, obviously, because it was an African project, but both OPIC in the US, when it was still OPIC, and the European Investment Bank, both had a lot of interest to see, alternative renewable energy projects coming on in a place like Ethiopia. They had participated in some of the hydro projects, but had never done any other renewable energy there. They also were very interested to have a project where there would be private financing to go along with the public financing. So this was done as a public-private partnership with the government and with the other development banks right from the beginning. All right. So and of this $1.5 billion of debt, $1 billion comes from the development banks. Another 500 million comes from the export credit agencies of the countries that produce the equipment that produce the power. So that's primarily the turbines, but also the steam pipes that are out in the fields and other equipment that you need to create a power plant. So it just so happens in geothermal, most of the good turbines are made in Japan. So the Japanese Export Credit Bank is very, interested and aggressive in providing loans to projects like this, right? So just think of a $2 billion project as 500 million of equity, 500 million of export credit, and $1 billion, supported by the development banks. Okay, so in this $500 million so there's a catch. None of the loans come in until it's proven that steam is coming out of the ground. So we can have all the Icelandic experts and other geothermal experts in the world running around, doing scientific studies and proving that there, is steam below the ground, and it's usually 2 to 3 kilometers, 2,000 to 3,000 meters down where this steam is. So it's not like you can see it or touch it, although sometimes it's coming out of the ground. And then you have to estimate how hot is that steam, because the efficiency of geothermal power is all about the hotter the steam, the more force there is, the more power you get through the turbines, the lower the cost. So you need high temperature steam, which is between 250 and 350 centigrade. So so there's these estimates, but they want to see steam coming out of the ground. So the trick there is, to drill those wells, it's $7 to $10 million a piece to drill the wells. You need to drill 3 wells to get enough steam out that the banks will start lending. That costs about $50 million. One of the reasons geothermal has never really taken off is because most people don't want to risk $50 million, knowing that, not knowing whether they're really going to get steam out of the ground or not. Oil and gas companies do this all the time, right? Oil and gas drilling is much riskier than drilling for steam with geothermal, and they risk more money and lose more money all the time, but they've never been willing to take that technology and shift it over and start focusing on geothermal. I think that will happen going forward. You will see as demand for oil and gas goes down, I think you're going to see a lot of this equipment and money move towards geothermal, and that will open up the sector. Right now, only 1% of the known geothermal power in the world has been developed for power or heating. So that's sort of your conundrum. Who's going to take that initial risk? So our company took the risk to even before you get to the point of drilling, you have to create contracts with the government, and you have to get the rights to drill on the land, and you have to work with the Ministry of Mines, and you have to work with the Ministry of Environment, you have to work with the Ministry of Energy and Water, and all these things to get your agreements that you can even set up to do this. That takes years. Getting the energy company to sign a power purchase agreement that says they're going to purchase your power for the next 30 years takes years. So It basically takes 2 or 3 years, $5 to $10 million to get set up, even to spend the $50 million it takes to drill the first 3 wells before you can bring in the rest of the equity and bring in the debt. So you can just imagine that there's a spectrum of investors, who are willing to take these risks. And some people have to, believe in the project. They have to believe in geothermal. They have to believe in Ethiopia. They have to believe in, the markets, and that this is a good thing. And, and that the risks are reasonable in the end, and that they're willing to take a reasonable return. Some people would tell us, we're not even going to touch any project in Ethiopia without generating a 25%, equity return. Well, that again, that's not good for the people, the communities. It's not sustainable. There's no reason why a project like this can't get done at, let's say, 8 to 10% returns for the, for the equity investors, and even lower for the debt investors. So part of this now is to find the people that will believe in the project enough and all the pieces that will accept reasonable returns. So over time, so we started with a group of individuals, our own company and the people in Iceland. We found other investors who were willing to take the initial risk. Then for the $50 million, we brought in a French energy and infrastructure fund called Meridium, who again, does projects all over the world, but was specifically looking to expand into renewable energy and into Africa, and was willing to take the Ethiopian risk. So, and then when you can bring a group like, let me do 2 other things. We also happened to be doing this right at the time when President Obama was announcing his Power Africa program, and looking for power solutions in Africa, that would promote renewable solutions. So we became the largest project of Power Africa, and had a lot of support from the Obama administration and John Kerry and the Ernest Moniz, the Secretary of Energy at the time. USAID and OPIC were both involved in Power Africa, so we had their support. The German government came in and created something called the Global Risk Mitigation Fund for early stage geothermal projects, because again, that's where all the risk is. So all these projects are about finding partners, who understand the mission, but also understand the risks and are willing to help mitigate the risk. Because otherwise they never get done. Nobody would ever, in their right mind really would ever start this project without having some kind of vision for how it could all come together, and how, and how the pieces would be there. So let me just leave that there, and I'm sure we can come back and answer some other questions. Because let me compare that with this conservation project, Bhutan for Life. Because even though it was conservation, it's the same thing. Everybody said, you're never going to raise $50 million, for the parks in Bhutan. Maybe you can raise $4 or $5 million, but you can't raise 50. Well, when we talked to all the park managers and did the bottoms-up assessment of what they really needed, and this is over a 15-year period. This isn't $50 million to be spent all at once. This is $50 million to cover the needs of the parks for 15 years, while the economy of Bhutan is building up to the point where the government will be able to do this themselves. So we basically started this project and went to it was the idea of the Minister of Agriculture and Forestry in Bhutan to begin with. And then he reached out to WWF, and we reached out to other private donors and institutions, and started designing this project. Again, it took a year or 2 to design the project. So while you're coming up with a project to raise $40 or $50 million, you need $2, $3, $4 million for a budget just to plan the project and put all the pieces together, and pay for the marketing and the global fundraising over that four-year period. So you needed some individuals, to basically believe in this project and put up the early stage risk capital, for this $4 million. So basically we had 2 or 3 individuals put up the original money, and WWF matched it. So we created this $4 or $5 million pool, which allowed us to bring the project together. and go out and talk to potential donors. So the main part was a 2-year study from all the people in the parks, where they produced a 200-page document that outlined the conservation plan of Bhutan over the next 15 years and had a detailed, itemized budget of what they needed in each park, over that period of time, and how the money would be spent and what the different focus areas would be, how the people inside the parks would be part of this, because this 30% of the population of Bhutan lives inside of these parks, given that it's 50% of the country. So we didn't want this to be, sort of roped off conservation areas for, animals and wildlife and plants. We wanted, this is a living, breathing space. So we needed it to be part of the economic development plan of Bhutan, including energy, including their hydropower and other things. So there was a 2-year plan to put this together. And at that time we put together a group of like-minded donors who believed in the long-term, project. The prime minister, who had been just newly elected, got very involved, gave a TED talk on Bhutan and this project that ended up getting like 3 million views and was sort of our number one, campaign ad to raise the money. So during that period, we basically got $10 million in philanthropic donations from individuals that were committed first. Then there was a Thai family that saw the TED talk that ended up giving $5 million. So we had $15 million from individual donors. And then we had the Global Environmental Facility, who had given money to other conservation projects in Bhutan, came in with $3 to $5 million. And finally, the Green Climate Fund in Korea, put in $26 million to close the deal. All right. Now, that sounds interesting and logical, but Green Climate Fund had never given money to a conservation project. They had never given money to Bhutan. There was a lot of debate inside the fund on whether, why help a country that's so small, first of all, and we had to make the case of where Bhutan was and all the rivers that came through and how it was supporting, the watersheds in both India and Bangladesh. And basically there were, upwards of 2 billion people counting on the environment, that Bhutan was helping to support in the Himalayas, tie it into climate change in the Himalayas and everything else. So finally people bought off on the argument, and then, they understood that preservation of the environment was key to, really helping mitigate some of the climate change issues, in that area, and preserving the parks and the watersheds, including the rivers, was critical to it. So it took probably 2 years longer than people thought it was going to take. It took 4 or 5 years instead of 2 or 3 years, but it was, it came through and has been one of the more successful large-scale conservation projects that WWF has done. Now, interestingly enough, when the prime minister went on his TED talk, the last thing he said in his TED talk is he asked everybody, to please help them get this in Bhutan, and that he pledged he would then help start a program called Earth for Life, where they would take this model of large-scale conservation tied in with sustainable development and spread it around the world. And since then, WWF has now raised $1 billion to do similar programs in, at least 10 other countries. So they've started in Peru and Colombia. I know they're doing something in Mongolia. There's talks in Nepal, Namibia, Gabon, maybe Zambia, Cambodia. So there's 4 or 5 projects underway, and another sort of 5 to 10 projects that have been started. And it's attracted, a lot of interest, a lot of attention, and a lot of money. In fact, when Jeff Bezos gave away his $1 billion, 100 million of it went towards these Earth for Life projects. So anyway, that's just I wanted to give you some specific examples of how we work on various projects and various things, and I could give you some more details on how we're financing these food projects as well, which is being done at a whole different level, a smaller level to start with, but I think can grow. But oops. sorry for that. I just had an incoming call that that came in. So anyway, it shows that it takes, you have to understand the different investors that are out there, what their risk appetites are, what their capacity is, and how can you bring them together around specific themes, like the kind of themes that you're working on. And I know, I've talked with both Susan and Asim and Bindu before about the various projects. Very happy to, support you and think about the individual projects and how we could work together. I know one of the things Susan wanted me to talk about is this, and I think you've been talking about this concept of creating a one-page document that describes your project. So when we do these projects and start to talk to investors, we typically, have phone calls, send out emails. We attach a one-page summary document of what the project is and what we're looking for. That's usually backed up by a 10 or 15-page PowerPoint document that describes in more detail the project that we're trying to do. That can be supported by a website and all sorts of other, documents. But I think, how you describe your projects and what you're doing and how we can then take those to these various pockets of money to help finance the projects, beyond just the typical route of applying for grants and working with foundations. So we're happy to work with you on that. We'd be happy to work with you on any kind of projects in Bhutan. We obviously do a lot of work in Ethiopia. We're happy to work there. And as Susan knows, we're also doing projects in DRC with another NGO that we've helped to get started. They're in Equator province, which borders the Congo River. So if you're interested in expanding over to the Congo River, we'd love to work with you in DRC as well. So I'll leave it there and be happy to answer questions.
Okay, thank you, Michael. And Godi is on this call, just so you know.
Godi Gadar.
That's right. So just leave.
Thank you, Susan.
Great, thank you, Godi. So one of the things that we wanted to introduce as a concept, and of course, because I've said this. I think someone might need to, okay. And there's absolutely no pressure to participate in this at all, just so everybody knows. This is just completely out of our kind of way of thinking from the very beginning as a network of networks and how we can now support. I mean, we have participants now in this network of networks of 6 different river basins on 6 different continents. Many of you who have been in these last 3 calls, but many community groups who are not on these calls that we're still in touch with. And what I've come to understand through Michael and the people that he works with is that if each of your river basins can identify what your priority projects are, and Godi's been very kind to let us share screen with what a one-page looks like to present to potential investors, which Michael, and a bunch of people are willing to move forward on your behalf. Now, we have no way of knowing if this will deliver, right? We can't make any promises, but to really come up with this one page will be a beginning to at least put on the radar of many of the groups that Michael's describing that are out there right now looking for projects to fund because they care about climate change, they care about all these issues we've just raised about the environment, and that we're committed to literally decentralizing this to local communities. That unless this works on a community level, we are not interested in just imposing another big structure on people, right? It's to us, I think in general, it's the only thing that will be successful is if communities themselves take ownership and can create these sustainable structures moving forward. So this is kind of Carl's question about what is success and why do you keep doing this even when things are so difficult politically, because I think we found that people on the ground basically want clean water. They want to be able to grow good food, and they want energy that's renewable, that actually works. So these are the basics that we're really trying to make happen on community levels, and the mutual benefit sharing. And I think Senator Nemeth also brought up this idea of the transboundary cooperation, of that if the project can involve joint data sharing or using some of these technologies like the sensors, these are all to the benefit, right? That these technologies exist now and that they can be itemized in terms of cost. So I'm just going to share screen with you now with Godey's Go Conscious Earth one-pager to give you an idea of what this looks like when you're presenting it to funders. And we're more than happy to help in the next couple weeks identify with you which community groups would you want to include, how would you deal with the finances, what are your priorities, and in general, and you'll see this, that it needs to get very, very practical. I think Michael can speak to this as well, that funders want to understand what you're accomplishing, what you have accomplished, what you're going to accomplish, how much is it going to cost, and what are your outcomes, and how are you going to measure them? So with that, Ben, or can you share the screen, or I think I might be.
Susan, I can share it. I just want to I'm ready to share the screen, but I just wanted to kind of set the stage by saying that the way our community, like academic community or NGOs or many community partners are part of this, the way there are RFPs, they call for proposals that are being issued by government foundations like National Science Foundation or NASA. They are similarly called international agencies like World Bank have their programs, or development banks have their programs. So another way to kind of actually make the difference on the ground is by using these public-private mechanisms that Michael explained in a lot more detail, right? So it's not just purely private sector in the sustainable finance, is like a partnership. And what we want to do it as part of our Transboundary Watering Cooperation Network that we organize along with NPACs, and maybe we can talk with Carl as well about if NPACs is interested in collaborating with us on this kind of call for proposals in a public-private partnership mode. But as Transboundary Watering Cooperation Network, we are interested in moving forward with issuing a call for proposals. That would be reviewed by Michael Phillips and Anikat's team, and there are other potential funders in sustainable finance that Michael can bring to the table as well. So I think systematically what we want to do is we want to set up a call and then work with between as a Transboundary Watering Cooperation Network Secretariat, we're willing to facilitate the creation of these projects, seeding how the projects are developed in these different basins. Work with us, they should have focus on water security. That is our ultimate, since that's our goal, so we really want to have focus on water security. We will moderate the process of those one-pager creations and pitch the ideas to the Michael Phillips team. And then we can process, connect you to, and then you can work out in terms of the details and actual implementation of these projects. So for example, as a twin, we are interested in doing work on setting up say knowledge sharing platforms that came out in, or the Highlands to Oceans projects that we talked about in the last meeting, the science diplomacy, or regenerative ag and water quality related work that has been going on as previous, some of our previous interventions in Indus and Jordan River. I see that Clive is not here, but so there are all these kind of work that we're doing. We want to expand our funding opportunities beyond the traditional organizations and banks to these innovative public-private mechanisms. And I think, so this is we were taking this opportunity to announce that opportunity, and we will launch the RFA. And between Susan and myself, we would, if you are interested in submitting a one-pager like this, please feel free to email us. So that's really the message, and I'll share it. Sorry for this long-winded intervention, Susan, but I just wanted to.
No, very helpful. Very helpful, Seem.
Okay, so this is like the Go Conscious Earth, where the GODI is based in Congo. This Michael's team has funded. This is like an example. I think you can see it. So this was like their one page. It's like you have a vision statement. You kind of like identify the problem, and then you identify the solution, and then scaling up for real impact. So I mean, I'm just presenting it. Maybe Michael or GODI or Susan, you want to say more about it? I'm just sharing the screen here. If you want, I can make it bigger, any part, if that's better. So.
No, that's great. I'll turn it over to GODI or to Michael to just say a little bit about how what was the process like in trying to identify what you felt was the most important things about what you wanted to accomplish, and then how to move forward.
But also seek the like feedback from the participants to see like what do they think about this, right? So
absolutely.
So very quick. I mean, I think like GODI or Michael, if you want to like have a very quick like 30-second perspective on this, and then I can stop sharing and engage the audience.
GODI, go ahead.
I'm in the mute.
We can hear you now.
Yeah. So again, I spoke early. Thank you very much for Michael and Susan to be here, and they're very much aware of what's going on in the DRC. So I'm a founder again of a Go Conscious Earth, and the vision behind of the whole conservation. It was basically as the ecosystems is all combined. If you divide it, take an equation of indigenous people and take them out to equation, it will never work. So it's basically we combine everybody's involvement and really to sustain them in the long term, and to understand what's really important to the ecology and the culture there, and to respect them and to carry on. And we started earlier. I funded this program in 2012, but we implemented the clean water initiatives. I found with the local people, they requested that because the water is essential, as the water is the life. So that's how we started. We started with the clean water initiatives, and then we go forward with the renewable energy and empower the local people in the sustainability program. So food securities, and that will be the steps and to go. When you look at our first page, it says all that, and as well as and create this opportunity to bring economical way of to sustain the local people, go from there. So I wanted to stop it there because there's a lot of things that we can share. We don't have much time about it. Michael, if you wanted to emphasize some of the few words, that's fine.
Yeah, no, I just think, it's just good to take all the pieces, sort of the summary of the thinking of your project, and put it on one page so people can see it before you bombard them with too much information. Like sometimes people are so busy, they just can't get through 5, 10, 15 pages of, slides in a PowerPoint deck. So if they have a one-page summary and you can get people interested off of that one page with a little bit of the history, a little bit of the organization, and a little bit of where you're going, and some idea of the, of the amount of money you're talking about, it's just a good way to get people's attention and interest.
Okay, thank you, Michael. So yeah, Asim, let's open it up to anyone who has any questions or comments.
I would say like to make it the process systematic, like what we can do is like say we can talk now, and we can like release RFP and proper process on our twin website. So I'm pitching the link to that. It's the transboundarywater.org, and we will release RFP there, but this was just a preview. And you can contact we'll lay down the process of the people who would be coordinating this, and you can contact them, and we'll work with you to actually make these projects and take action and make the difference on the ground. So that is our purpose. Of course, I know there could be a lot of political agendas that could be part of this. Some people might say, well, you're doing work and there are a lot of like colonial and other kinds of challenges associated with banks and these kind of work. So I just want to be mindful that that is, like we are like more like working from the Transboundary Watering Cooperation Network from their perspective. So that's our goal, is to make the difference on the ground from that perspective. But we see opportunities for track 2, track 3, and some of these discussions that we had even for track 1 today could be, we can make the difference on the ground by harnessing this public-private partnership. So I'll leave it there, and any feedback from you is welcome. You can write it down or questions also in the white paper, please. So.
I just wanted to comment briefly, and as soon as somebody raises their hand, please feel free to start. But I think the economics becomes disconnected from the social, the cultural, and the environmental. And I think this is an opportunity, because we don't have a lot of time to really solve these problems now. I think we have to access what is there and what good, decent people want to accomplish now. And I agree that there's always corruption. We're totally, and I think you'll understand from the people that we've been working with, there's a lot of suspicion and distrust about money in general and where it comes from and how it gets distributed. And we understand all the problems with capitalism and with colonialism. And we are totally not, that's the whole point of decentralizing this and giving the power to the networks themselves, but also to make sure that they're listening to their communities to really solve these problems, and the mutual benefit sharing and how to set up that infrastructure so that really works. But I do think it does take money. And I think understanding the world of finance now and how we can really work with people of goodwill to make these things happen, the time frame is much shorter than waiting on longer funding processes. So I see Sandra and Ali with their hands up. So Sandra.
Hi, I'm Sandra Mejens. I'm working with the Transboundary Waters between Ecuador and Colombia on drought and water governance. For many years from the Netherlands, I have been working with the diasporas and remittance and microfinance. And we have a lot of problems, and we learned that there are a lot of lack of trust is when we are especially looking in partnership with the countries of origins and the small scale funding for projects in those countries. Later, I have been working with disaster risk reduction also, where the idea to invest $1 and to save $2 if you react on time, it should be a good motivation for making this public-private partnership. But also we learned that we have to find some mechanisms to transport part of the expensive of recovering also to the private sector. And that was a very difficult issue. So now I'm working very close with the transboundary issues with the polycentric governance. And for the first, after the Listen Phillips, I really find that it's a very, I didn't think about it, but now I'm thinking that it's a very opportunity, because my idea is that we have to work in the cost of action and the price of inaction. What it means? It means that the cost of not doing something related with the environment costs more than do something that is very wrong. So my learning experience from the transboundary borders is that there is a lot of cash involved. So in some way, money is no problem. There is a lot of private sectors making business in the borders. The second one is very flexible, this kind of trade-off between people. So the state is not really strong regulating business investment. But what we need is to encourage communities to properly invest in maybe in small scale financial, sustainable environmental business. And I guess it's a good opportunity to create this kind of low scale business model and to bring some principles of conservation, preservation, especially through the benefit that the communities can do and the entrepreneurs in the communities they can do. So by the polycentric governance, I learned that we have this kind of nodes or systems that they are working and they are progressing. Because even if they are conflict or the state is not very present, they have a very good connection each other because they need to trade for the service that the communities need. So even if there are some disagreement between the countries, the local communities, they always find a way to trade and to continue doing business. So actually, I am very pleased for the talk. I know the financial issues always is a little scary, but creating a model, a business model with the environmental sustainable objectives, I think it's a very nice starting way
Great.
to do something else.
Yeah.
We have only 2 minutes left, Ali, and I see Senator Mim. So the time is of essence here, please.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for that, Sandra. We agree. We should talk more about that.
Well, very quickly, first I want to thank you for taking the lead and creating this network and bringing us together. If I'm not mistaken, this is third and the final round. It's still a very fragile network, and I think its service must be recognized in creating a community of practice and learning. And therefore, my first request is for you and other colleagues to consider continuing this learning process and having similar learning dialogues like we had today, periodically a few times a year if possible. And that will help us generate cross transboundary regions, different ideas to collaborate and learn from each other. That's first point. Second is that ideas like equitable benefit sharing and what I submitted, joint institutions to manage transboundary rivers, which out of 106, probably 1 or 2 have joint institutions, are important ones. And these ideas need some buyers. And big buyers like multilateral development banks and MDBs can take the lead in promoting these such institutions and equitable benefit sharing initiatives in different regions, in different basins. And that can be a very good learning point for us to build upon successes from different areas. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Great.
Senator Memon? You're muted.
I just would like to congratulate you, the organizers, for bringing out this. I think this is what I call briefly out-of-box solution. And Susan, this is what Michael has brought in. And I will say, Asim will take you on that, certainly. And this idea of one page normally is a very good way of beginning point. So we will take you on this. That's all I will say. Congratulations. That is really great.
Great. Thank you very much. All right, Asim, would you like to close out our session today?
Yeah, I mean, thank you so much. I mean, we are out of time. I really appreciate it. Was not just me. There was a large team here at Institute of Environmental Diplomacy, Ben Ryan, Stefan, Bindu, Caitlin, and at NPAX, it was, Carl, Sheila, Claire, Jordan. I'm sorry if I'm missing anybody's name here. So really, really appreciate all of your participation. Your participation really made this happen. We will be hopefully going to Geneva as well. Hopefully our roundtable proposals would be accepted. If that happens, some of you will invite you to be part, like it would be hybrid. So I would encourage all of you to participate by Zoom, but we'll also invite some of you to come in person in Geneva. So we'll follow up on that. We'll follow up on these one-pager proposals. We'll follow up on the white paper. We'll follow up on other proposals that we're working on with NSF and NASA. So the opportunities are going, and I really want to take early into this. We will continue this. Hopefully we'll have in-person meetings soon. Our goal is to have in-person meetings. That's a week-long in-person meeting on this topic. That's my goal. So we'll get there. Hopefully in one of these places, beautiful places that we're talking about. So thank you so much. Really, really appreciate your participation and active contribution. And please stay in touch. We'll be following up with a lot of emails about white paper and the process. So forth. So
And thank you, Michael. And we'll stay in touch with you as well. So thank you, everyone, for coming.
Thanks.
We'll
Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Asim.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.